What happens when a desperate king seeks forbidden knowledge from the realm of the dead? When the most powerful man in Israel abandons everything he once believed to consult forces he himself had banned? Today, we're entering one of the darkest chapters in biblical history. A story so disturbing that many prefer to skip over it entirely. This isn't your typical Sunday school lesson. This is the account of a midnight seance that changed the fate of a nation forever. King Saul, the man who once stood head and shoulders above his people, now crouches in disguise outside a cave in Endor. The same king who had driven witches and mediums from the land is about to beg one of them for help. The irony is as thick as the darkness surrounding him. Inside that cave waits a woman who traffics in the supernatural, a medium who claims she can speak to the dead. What she's about to witness will terrify her more than anything in her dark profession, because when she calls up the spirit Saul demands, something actually answers. This is the story of Samuel's ghost, summoned from beyond the grave to deliver the most chilling prophecy ever spoken. It's a tale of desperation so complete that it drives a king to violate his own laws, abandon his own faith, and seek answers from the very darkness he once fought against. You'll witness a supernatural encounter that defies explanation, hear words that sealed the doom of Israel's first dynasty, and discover why some knowledge is too dangerous to seek. This isn't just about ancient history. It's about what happens when we turn away from God's voice and start listening to other whispers in the dark. Get ready for a journey into the forbidden, where the boundary between life and death dissolves, and where a desperate king learns that some questions are better left unasked. The witch of Endor is waiting, and the dead are about to speak. To understand how Israel's first king ended up begging a witch for help, you need to know the tragic arc of Saul's life, a story that reads like a Shakespearean tragedy written by the hand of God. It all began with such promise. The people of Israel had demanded a king, rejecting God's direct rule in favor of human monarchy. Samuel warned them about the dangers, but they insisted, "We want a king over us, then we will be like all the other nations." When God finally granted their request, he chose Saul, a young man from the tribe of Benjamin, who was literally head and shoulders above everyone else. Tall, handsome, and humble, Saul seemed like the perfect choice. When Samuel anointed him, the Spirit of God came upon him with power, transforming him into a different person entirely. The early years were golden. Saul delivered the city of Jabesh-Gilead from Ammonite siege, united the fractured tribes, and led Israel to victory after victory. The people loved him, God blessed him, and Samuel guided him. Everything was exactly as it should be. But then came the cracks. The first major fracture happened at Gilgal. Facing a massive Philistine army, Saul was supposed to wait 7 days for Samuel to arrive and offer the burnt offering. But as his troops began deserting and panic set in, Saul took matters into his own hands. He offered the sacrifice himself, a direct violation of God's command. Samuel's words when he arrived were devastating. "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom will not endure." The second blow came during the war against the Amalekites. God's command was crystal clear: destroy everything. Men, women, children, livestock, everything. But Saul spared King Agag and kept the best of the sheep and cattle, claiming he wanted to sacrifice them to the Lord. Samuel's response became one of the most famous rebukes in Scripture. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. That day Samuel turned to leave, and Saul grabbed his robe in desperation. The fabric tore, and Samuel declared, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you." From that moment, everything changed. The Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit began tormenting him. David entered the picture, first as a musician to soothe Saul's troubled mind, then as the giant killer who captured the nation's heart. Jealousy consumed Saul like a cancer. The man who had once been God's chosen became God's rejected, spending his final years hunting David through the wilderness instead of leading his people. And now, facing his greatest crisis, Saul discovered the most terrifying truth of all. When you reject God's voice, eventually he stops speaking altogether. Before we witness Samuel's ghostly return, you need to understand who this man was in life, because his death left a void in Israel that nothing could fill. Samuel wasn't just another prophet. He was the bridge between the age of judges and the age of kings, the last of the old guard and the maker of the new. From his miraculous birth to his mother Hannah's barren womb, Samuel had been set apart for something extraordinary. As a child, he had heard God's voice calling in the temple while serving under Eli the priest. That first divine encounter established a pattern that would define his entire life. Samuel became the man through whom God spoke to his people. When the Lord had something to say to Israel, he said it through Samuel. For decades, Samuel had been the nation's spiritual backbone. He judged their disputes, led them in worship, and most importantly, served as their direct line to heaven. When Israel needed guidance, they came to Samuel. When they faced enemies, Samuel called on God. When they sinned, Samuel interceded for them. But Samuel's relationship with Saul was complicated and heartbreaking. He had been the one to anoint Saul as king, pouring oil on his head and declaring him God's chosen. Samuel had mentored him, guided him, and genuinely loved him like a son. That's what made Saul's disobedience so devastating to the old prophet. Each act of rebellion wasn't just a violation of God's law, it was a personal betrayal of the man who had invested everything in Saul's success. When Samuel delivered God's rejection of Saul, it broke his own heart in the process. The scripture tells us that Samuel mourned for Saul, grieving as if for a dead son. Even after God had moved on and chosen David, Samuel couldn't let go of what might have been. The prophet who had spoken God's words with such authority was reduced to weeping over a king who had thrown away his divine calling. When Samuel finally died, all Israel gathered to mourn him. They buried him at his home in Ramah, and the entire nation wept. But their tears weren't just for a beloved leader. They were mourning the end of an era. With Samuel gone, who would speak for God? Who would intercede when judgment threatened? Who would anoint the next king or deliver the hard truths that leaders needed to hear? The silence that followed Samuel's death was deafening. For the first time in generations, Israel had no clear prophetic voice, no direct pipeline to heaven. And for Saul, that silence was the most terrifying sound in the world. The man who had rejected Samuel's counsel in life would soon become desperate enough to seek it in death, a quest that would lead him to the darkest corner of his kingdom and the most forbidden encounter of his reign. The crisis that would drive Saul to his desperate act began with a sight that turned his blood to ice. From his position on Mount Gilboa, the king of Israel looked across the Jezreel Valley and saw his worst nightmare made manifest. The Philistines had assembled the largest army in their history. Their forces stretched across the plain at Shunem, like a dark sea of bronze and iron, their weapons glinting in the sunlight, their war chariots arranged in perfect formation. This wasn't just another border skirmish. This was an invasion force designed to crush Israel once and for all. The numbers were staggering. thousands upon thousands of seasoned warriors, equipped with superior iron weapons while many of Saul's men still carried bronze. The Philistines had learned from their previous defeats and had come prepared for total war. But it wasn't just the size of the enemy army that terrified Saul. It was what their presence represented. The Philistines had chosen this moment carefully. They knew about the civil war that had torn Israel apart, knew about David's exile and the division in the kingdom. They had watched Saul's strength crumble and his support erode, and now they were moving in for the kill. Standing on Mount Gilboa with his own forces, Saul felt the weight of his failures crushing down on him. His army was smaller, poorly equipped, and demoralized. Many of his best warriors had defected to David. The unity that had once made Israel strong was shattered, and everyone knew it. But the physical threat was nothing compared to the spiritual crisis Saul faced. In previous battles, he had been able to consult God through the Urim and Thummim, those sacred lots that revealed divine will. Samuel had been there to seek the Lord's guidance and deliver his battle plans. The presence of God had gone before Israel's armies, turning impossible odds into guaranteed victories. Now there was only silence. Saul tried everything. He consulted the Urim, but they gave no answer. He waited for dreams, but his sleep brought only nightmares. He called for prophets, but none came forward with a word from the Lord. The God who had once spoken so clearly through Samuel now seemed to have turned his face away completely. The terror that gripped Saul wasn't just fear of military defeat. It was the horror of facing his greatest crisis without divine guidance. He was about to lead his people into battle with no assurance of victory, no strategy from heaven, no promise of deliverance. As night fell over the two armies, Saul stared across the valley at the Philistine campfires and felt utterly alone. Tomorrow would bring either triumph or catastrophe, and for the first time in his reign, he had no idea which it would be. That's when desperation began whispering its dark suggestions, leading the king of Israel toward a choice that would damn his soul and seal his fate. In the darkness of his tent, King Saul paced like a caged animal. The Philistine army lay just across the valley, and dawn would bring a battle that could end his kingdom forever. But it wasn't the enemy that tormented him most. It was the deafening silence from heaven. He had tried everything a godly king should try. The Urim and Thummim, those sacred stones that had once revealed God's will so clearly, now lay cold and unresponsive in the high priest's hands. No matter how desperately they cast them, no divine answer came. His dreams, once filled with prophetic visions, now brought only restless sleep and meaningless fragments. Where God had once spoken in the night, there was now only emptiness. He had summoned every prophet in the kingdom, hoping one of them might carry a word from the Lord. But they came with nothing, no visions, no revelations, no guidance for the crisis at hand. The prophetic voice that had guided Israel for generations had fallen silent. For any other king, this might have been disappointing. For Saul, it was devastating confirmation of what he already knew. God had abandoned him completely. The Almighty, who had once empowered him to tear apart lions and defeat armies, now refused to even acknowledge his existence. But desperation has a way of eroding principles, and as the hours ticked toward dawn, Saul's mind began exploring darker possibilities. If God wouldn't speak to him, perhaps there were other voices that would. If heaven was closed, maybe he could find answers elsewhere. The irony was bitter and complete. Years earlier, in a fit of religious zeal, Saul had issued a royal decree banishing all mediums and spiritists from Israel. He had driven out the witches, destroyed their shrines, and executed those who trafficked in the supernatural. The law was clear. Anyone who consulted the dead was an abomination to the Lord. Now that same king was about to violate his own commandment. Find me a woman who is a medium, he commanded his servants, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to go and inquire of her." His men exchanged nervous glances. They knew what this meant, knew the spiritual and legal boundaries their king was about to cross. But they also knew better than to refuse a desperate monarch. "There is one in Endor," they finally replied. Endor. The name itself seemed to carry shadows. It was a small town in Philistine-controlled territory, a place where the old ways still lingered in hidden corners. If anyone had survived Saul's purge of the occult, it would be there. Saul disguised himself, trading his royal robes for common clothes, covering his distinctive height with a hooded cloak. Under cover of darkness, he slipped away from his army with just 2 trusted servants, leaving behind his crown, his kingdom, and his conscience. The journey to Endor was treacherous, requiring them to circle around enemy lines and navigate hostile territory. But Saul pressed on, driven by a desperation that had consumed his last shred of spiritual integrity. The king who had once been anointed by God's prophet was now sneaking through the night to consult God's enemy, seeking forbidden knowledge from the realm of the dead. The cave entrance was barely visible in the moonless night, hidden among the rocks outside Endor like a wound in the earth itself. Saul and his 2 servants approached cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the soft ground. This was enemy territory in more ways than one, not just Philistine land, but a realm where darkness held dominion. Inside the cave, a fire flickered against stone walls carved with symbols that would have made any faithful Israelite recoil in horror. This was the workshop of a woman who dealt in death, who claimed to bridge the gap between the living and the departed. She had survived Saul's purge by hiding in this remote place, practicing her forbidden arts in secret. When the 3 cloaked figures appeared at her threshold, the medium's first instinct was suspicion. Strangers arriving at midnight usually meant trouble, especially for someone in her profession. The tall one in the center carried himself with an authority that made her nervous, but his face was hidden in shadow. "Consult a spirit for me," the stranger said, his voice carefully disguised. "Bring up for me the one I name." The woman's eyes narrowed. This felt like a trap. "Surely you know what Saul has done," she replied, her voice sharp with fear. "He has cut off the mediums and the spiritists from the land. Why do you lay a snare for my life to cause me to die?" It was a reasonable fear. King Saul's campaign against the occult had been ruthless and thorough. Mediums had been executed, their tools destroyed, their practices banned under penalty of death. For all she knew, this could be a royal agent testing her loyalty to the new laws. But the stranger's response carried a weight that made her blood run cold. "As the Lord lives," he swore, using the most sacred oath in Israel, "no punishment shall come upon you for this thing." The irony was staggering. The same king who had banned her profession was now swearing by the name of the Lord that she would be safe practicing it. But the woman didn't know who stood before her. She only heard the conviction in his voice and felt the desperation radiating from his presence. "Whom shall I bring up for you?" she asked, her resistance crumbling. The answer came without hesitation. "Bring up Samuel for me." Samuel, the great prophet whose death had plunged the nation into mourning, the man whose voice had been the voice of God to an entire generation. If anyone could provide the guidance this stranger sought, it would be Samuel. The woman began her dark ritual, calling upon forces that God had forbidden his people to contact. She expected the usual theatrics, vague impressions, ambiguous messages, the kind of supernatural parlor tricks that kept desperate clients coming back for more. What happened next shattered every assumption she had about her own abilities. A figure began to materialize in the flickering firelight, not the shadowy, half-formed apparition she was used to conjuring, but a solid, unmistakable presence that radiated authority and anger. This wasn't some demonic impersonation or psychological projection. This was actually Samuel, the prophet of the Most High God, rising from the realm of the dead. The medium's scream pierced the night air. In all her years of trafficking with spirits, she had never encountered anything like this. And in that moment of supernatural terror, she suddenly understood who her mysterious client really was. "Why have you deceived me?" she shrieked, pointing at the tall stranger. "You are Saul." The king's disguise was useless now. Standing before the ghost of the man who had anointed him, Saul could no longer hide behind false identities and midnight deceptions. The cave fell silent except for the woman's terrified breathing and the crackling of the fire. Then Samuel's spirit spoke, and his voice carried the same authority it had possessed in life, but now it was edged with fury. "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" The words cut through the darkness like a blade, filled with righteous indignation that made the very air seem to vibrate. This wasn't the gentle Samuel who had once guided young kings and comforted troubled souls. This was the prophet of God, angry at being dragged back from his rest to deal with the man who had rejected every word of counsel he had ever given. Saul fell to his knees, not in worship but in desperation, so complete it had stripped away his last shred of royal dignity. "I am in great distress," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has departed from me. He no longer answers me, either by prophets or by dreams. So I have called on you to tell me what to do." The confession was devastating in its honesty. Here was the king of Israel admitting that God had abandoned him, that heaven had gone silent, that he was so desperate he had violated his own laws to seek help from the dead, suffering from depression. But Samuel's response offered no comfort, no hope, no gentle restoration. Instead, it was a final, crushing judgment that sealed Saul's fate forever. "Why do you consult me, now that the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy?" Samuel's spirit demanded. "The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David." Each word was like a hammer blow, driving home truths that Saul had spent years trying to deny. The kingdom was already lost. David was already chosen. Everything Saul had fought to preserve was already gone. "Because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites," Samuel continued, his voice growing more terrible with each syllable. "The Lord has done this to you today." The reference to the Amalekites brought back the memory of Saul's greatest failure, the moment when he had chosen partial obedience over complete surrender to God's will. That single act of rebellion had set in motion the chain of events that led to this midnight encounter with the dead. But Samuel wasn't finished. The worst was yet to come. "The Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hands of the Philistines," the prophet declared, his words carrying the weight of divine decree. The battle that Saul feared would indeed be lost. The army he had tried so desperately to save would be crushed. Then came the words that turned Saul's blood to ice. "Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me." The meaning was unmistakable. Within 24 hours, Saul would be dead. His sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, Malchishua, would die alongside him. The royal line would be extinguished in a single day of slaughter. "The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines," Samuel concluded, his prophecy complete. As the Spirit's words echoed in the cave, the supernatural presence began to fade. Samuel had delivered his final message to the king who had rejected him in life, and now he was returning to his rest, leaving behind a man whose doom was sealed. The witch cowered in the corner, overwhelmed by what she had witnessed. This hadn't been her doing. This was the hand of the Almighty reaching across the veil of death to pronounce final judgment on his rebellious servant. The words hung in the air like a death sentence written in fire. "Tomorrow, you and your sons will be with me." Saul's world collapsed in that instant. Everything he had feared, everything he had fought against, everything he had desperately tried to prevent, It was all going to happen within hours. The Philistines would win. His army would be destroyed, his sons would die, and he himself would join Samuel in the realm of the dead. The king who had once stood tall above his people now crumpled to the ground like a broken reed. His strength drained away completely, leaving him sprawled on the cave floor, paralyzed by the weight of his approaching doom. He hadn't eaten all day, consumed by anxiety about the coming battle, and now Samuel's prophecy had shattered what little resolve remained. This wasn't just fear of death, this was the horror of knowing that his entire life's work would be undone in a single day. The kingdom he had built, the victories he had won, the legacy he had hoped to leave, all of it would be swept away by Philistine swords. But perhaps most crushing of all was the confirmation of what he had suspected for years. God truly had abandoned him. There would be no last-minute reprieve, no divine intervention, no miraculous deliverance. The Lord, who had once empowered him to defeat Israel's enemies, would now deliver him into their hands. The medium watched this broken king with a mixture of terror and unexpected compassion. She had witnessed something beyond her understanding, a genuine supernatural encounter that had left even her shaken. But seeing Saul's complete collapse stirred something human in her heart. "Look," she said gently, approaching the fallen monarch, "your servant has obeyed you. I took my life in my hands and did what you told me to do. Now please listen to your servant and let me give you some food so you may eat and have the strength to go on your way." It was a remarkable moment. The woman whose profession Saul had tried to destroy was now showing him kindness in his darkest hour. She understood that this man, king or not, was about to face his final battle and needed strength for what lay ahead. But Saul refused. "I will not eat," he said, his voice hollow with despair. What was the point of food when death was coming with the sunrise? Why prolong the agony when tomorrow would bring only slaughter? His servants joined the woman in pleading with him. They had witnessed their king's complete breakdown and knew he couldn't face the Philistines in this condition. Finally, their combined urgency broke through his despair. The medium quickly prepared a meal. She killed a fattened calf and baked unleavened bread, working with the efficiency of someone who understood the urgency of the moment. It was a final act of hospitality before the storm, a last meal before the execution. Saul ate mechanically, tasting nothing, his mind already fixed on the approaching dawn. When the meal was finished, he and his servants rose to leave, stepping back into the night that would soon give way to his final day. As they disappeared into the darkness, the woman was left alone with the echoes of Samuel's terrible prophecy. She had summoned the dead and witnessed the pronouncement of doom upon Israel's king. Tomorrow, everything Samuel had predicted would come to pass, and the man who had sought forbidden knowledge would pay the ultimate price for his desperate rebellion against the God he had once served. The cave at Endor stands as one of Scripture's darkest warnings about what happens when we turn away from God's voice and start listening to other whispers in the shadows. Saul's midnight encounter with the witch reveals truths that every believer needs to understand about desperation, disobedience, and the dangerous paths they can lead us down. First, notice the tragic progression of Saul's spiritual decline. It didn't happen overnight. Years of partial obedience, selective hearing, and prideful rebellion had slowly severed his connection with the Almighty. When crisis struck, Saul discovered that you can't ignore God for years and then expect him to answer when it's convenient for you. The silence Saul experienced wasn't arbitrary divine cruelty. It was the natural consequence of persistent disobedience. God had spoken clearly through Samuel multiple times, but Saul had chosen his own way. Eventually, the Lord stopped wasting words on ears that refused to listen. This reveals why the occult is so dangerous and why God forbids it so absolutely. When people can't hear from heaven, they become vulnerable to voices from hell. Desperation makes us willing to seek answers from sources we would normally reject, and Satan is always ready to provide counterfeits for what God has withdrawn. Notice that the witch's power was real. Samuel actually appeared, but this wasn't because her magic was legitimate. It was because God allowed it to happen for His own purposes. Even when we turn to forbidden sources, we're still operating within the boundaries of divine sovereignty. The Lord used this dark encounter to deliver His final judgment on a rebellious king. Saul's story also warns us about the difference between seeking God and merely seeking answers. Saul wasn't interested in repentance, restoration, or returning to righteousness. He just wanted information that would help him win his battle. He approached the supernatural like a vending machine: insert desperation, receive guidance. But God isn't a cosmic consultant who exists to solve our problems while we continue in rebellion. He wants relationship, not just religious transactions. He desires obedience, not just occasional consultation. The modern applications are sobering. When facing crisis, how many believers abandon prayer and scripture for horoscopes, psychics, or New Age spirituality? When God seems silent, how quickly do we turn to fortune tellers, tarot cards, or other occult practices that promise the answers we crave? Saul's tragedy reminds us that spiritual desperation can drive us to violate our deepest convictions. The king who had once purged witches from the land ended up consulting one himself. When we're desperate enough, we'll compromise principles we once held sacred. The lesson is clear: better to wait in God's silence than to seek answers in Satan's noise. Better to face uncertainty while walking in obedience than to gain knowledge through rebellion, because some information comes at a price too high to pay, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And so we close one of the Bible's most haunting chapters, a story that reveals the terrifying consequences of turning away from God's voice to seek answers in forbidden places. King Saul's midnight encounter with the witch of Endor wasn't just ancient history. It was a warning written in blood about the dangers of spiritual desperation. Samuel's ghost delivered exactly what it promised: the truth, but it was a truth so devastating that it destroyed the man who sought it. Within hours of that supernatural encounter, everything the prophet predicted came to pass. Saul and his sons died on Mount Gilboa, the Philistines crushed Israel's army, and the kingdom was torn from the house of Saul forever. The king, who had once been anointed by God's prophet, ended his life condemned by that same prophet's spirit. The man who had driven witches from the land died because he consulted one. The ruler who had possessed divine favor lost everything because he chose rebellion over obedience. But here's what makes this story so relevant today. We all face moments when God seems silent, when our prayers feel like they're bouncing off the ceiling, when desperation tempts us to seek answers from sources we know we shouldn't trust. In those dark hours, remember Saul's tragedy. Remember that God's silence doesn't mean God's absence. Remember that some doors are better left unopened, some knowledge is too dangerous to seek, and some voices are too costly to hear. When you're facing your own Mount Gilboa moment, when the enemy seems overwhelming and heaven seems silent, don't make Saul's mistake. Don't trade your spiritual integrity for temporary answers. Don't abandon the God who loves you for spirits that will destroy you. Instead, wait in faith. Trust in His timing. Hold fast to His word even when you can't hear His voice, because the same God who judged Saul's rebellion is the God who rewards patient obedience, and His silence today doesn't mean His abandonment forever. If this story has gripped your heart, hit that subscribe button and join us as we continue exploring the most powerful accounts in biblical history. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the dangers of seeking answers in dark places. And remember, when God seems silent, He's still sovereign, and His plans are always better than our desperate shortcuts. The Witch of Endor is waiting in every generation. Will you resist her call?